Officer Dale Brunner, looked at the man on the park bench and saw a problem. He saw a worn backpack tucked under the bench. He saw a faded baseball cap pulled low over the eyes. He saw a few days of stubble and a stillness that did not belong in his clean little town. What Dale Brunner did not see, what he could not have seen from behind the wheel of his cruiser at 40 feet, was that the man under that cap was the reason half the homeless veterans in the state of Oregon had a roof over their heads that winter. There is a kind of blindness that does not come from a lack of light. It comes from being too certain you've already finished reading a person from the clothes they are wearing. Hold on to that. It matters later. The man on the bench was Keanu Reeves, and at 59 years old, he had learned to disappear in plain sight. It was a gray morning in Cedar Hollow, a small town tucked into the cedar country of western Oregon, where the rain came soft and constant, and the air smelled of wet bark and wood smoke. Cedar Hollow Commons sat at the center of town, a square of green with a band shell that nobody used anymore, a row of wrought iron benches gone dark with age, and a single enormous western red cedar that had been standing there since before the town had a name. Keanu sat on the bench nearest the cedar, a paper cup of black coffee going cold in his hands, his baseball cap tipped down so the brim threw a soft shadow across the upper half of his face. He liked it that way. The cap was an old habit and an old kindness to himself. With the brim down, nobody looked twice, nobody pointed, nobody pulled out a phone. He was just a tired man resting on a bench, and that anonymity was the most valuable thing he owned, because it let him see a place the way it actually was, instead of the way places rearranged themselves the moment they knew who was watching. Keanu had come to Cedar Hollow on foot. That was deliberate, too. He was walking a slow loop through the small towns of the valley, scouting locations for the next build, and he had found over the years that you could not understand a town from a car window. You had to walk it. You had to sit in its parks and stand in its diners, and feel how it treated a stranger who looked like he had nowhere to be. Because the foundation Keanu had quietly started and quietly funded for 2 decades, the one called Open Door, did not just put up buildings. It put up buildings in places that were ready to be kind to the people who would live in them. And the fastest way to learn whether a town was ready was to arrive looking like exactly the kind of person that town would rather not see. So far, Cedar Hollow had been gentle with him. A woman at the bakery had given him a day-old roll without being asked and without making a show of it. A boy on a bicycle had nodded at him the way you nod at a person, not at a problem. Keanu had been making a quiet note of these things. The town was passing a test it did not know it was taking. The foundation had started, the way the truest things usually start, almost by accident. Years earlier, Keanu had given a man on a visitor's sidewalk his coat, and then sat down on the cold concrete next to him for an hour, because the man had wanted to talk, and nobody had let him talk in a long time. The man had been a veteran. He had told Keanu a story about a friend he had lost, and somewhere in the telling Keanu had understood that the thing the man needed was not a coat. It was a door that locked from the inside. A room that was his, where the noise of the world could not get at him. Keanu had gone home that night and could not sleep, and in the morning he had called a lawyer and asked how a person went about building rooms with doors that locked from the inside for people who had run out of them. That was Open Door. It had grown over 2 decades into something larger than Keanu had ever planned, and he had kept his name off of all of it, partly because he did not want the buildings to be about him, and partly because he had learned that the moment his name went on a thing, people started performing for it instead of using it. He wanted the men who lived in those buildings to feel that the rooms were theirs, not gifts from a famous stranger they were supposed to be pretty grateful to, too. So he gave the money quietly, sat on the board quietly, and once a chair came to dinner and listened, and the rest of the time he walked. He walked because the buildings only worked in towns that were ready for them, and you could not tell from a spreadsheet whether a town was ready. You could only tell by being, for a few days, the kind of man the town would have to make room for. If a place treated tired stranger with basic decency, it would treat a housed veteran with it too. If it did not, No amount of fresh paint and good architecture would save the men who lived there from the thousand small cruelties of being unwanted. So Keanu walked into towns looking like a question, and the towns answered the question without knowing they had been asked. Cedar Hollow, until about 4 minutes from now, had been answering well. Then the cruiser slowed at the far curb, and the test changed. Across the green, on a bench of his own, sat an old man named Cornelius Whitaker. Cornelius was 71, and he had the weathered, settled look of a man who had spent more nights outdoors than most people spend hours. He was feeding the pigeons from a crumpled bag of crackers, his hands shaking slightly. His coat held together at one elbow with a safety pin. Most people in Cedar Hollow looked through Cornelius the way you look through a lamppost. He was used to it. He had made kind of peace with being invisible, the way you make peace with weather. But Cornelius was not looking through anything that morning. He was looking at the man on the bench by the cedar, and his old heart had done a slow, surprised turn in his chest, because Cornelius knew exactly who that man was. 11 years ago, Cornelius Whitaker had been sleeping under an overpass outside Portland, a veteran the country had thanked and then forgotten when a place opened up for him in a building he later learned had been paid for, start to finish, by a foundation called Open Door. He had met its founder exactly once, at a small dinner the foundation held every year for the men it had housed. The founder had not given a speech. He had sat at the table and listened, mostly, and when Cornelius told a long and not entirely sober story about a dog he had once owned in the service, the founder had laughed in the right places and asked the dog's name, and remembered it for the rest of the night. Cornelius had never forgotten that. A man with that much money and that much fame, and what he gave you was that he remembered your dog's name. Now that same man was sitting 20 yards away in a beat-up cap with a cold coffee, trying to look like nobody. And Cornelius understood at once what he was doing. He was hiding on purpose, so Cornelius did the kindest thing he knew how to do. He kept the old man's secret. He turned back to his pigeons and said nothing, and let Keanu be nobody, for as long as the world would allow it. It was strange, Cornelius thought, the things you remembered about a man. He could not have told you a single thing Keanu Reeves had ever said in a movie. But he could have told you, 11 years later, the exact weight of the moment at that dinner when the famous man had leaned across the table after Cornelius finished the story about it. Quiet, just to him, not for the room. Shep. That's a good name for a dog. And then he had gone back to listening to the next man and the next, until every veteran at that long table had been listened to all the way to the end of whatever he needed to say, which most of them had not experienced from anybody in years. That was the whole thing, Cornelius had decided afterward. The money built the rooms, sure. What had actually reached down under the bridge and pulled Cornelius Whitaker back up into the land of the living was the discovery, at that table, that he was still a person somebody would bother to listen to. You can give a man a key, but you cannot give a man back his sense that he counts for something. That you can only return to him by treating him for one evening, like he always had. So when Cornelius saw the cruiser slow at the curb and saw the officer's head turn toward the bench by the cedar, and felt the whole familiar machinery of being looked through begin to crank up around a man who did not deserve it, something happened in his old chest that had not happened in a long time. He got angry, not the helpless anger he usually swallowed. A clean, clear anger on behalf of someone else, which is the only kind that ever steadies the hands. The world allowed it for about 4 more minutes. Officer Dale Brunner had been on the Cedar Hollow force for 22 years, and he was the kind of officer the town tolerated rather than celebrated. He had a thick neck losing a war with his collar, a haircut he had been getting since high school, and a file of complaints that had been smoothed over so many times the paper had gone soft. Dale had peaked early. Somewhere around the year he made varsity, and he had spent the decades since chasing the thing of that year through the one thing that still gave it to him, which was the badge. The badge meant people did what he said. The badge meant he mattered. He had built an entire self out of that, and a self built out of being obeyed becomes very fragile the first time someone declines. Dale scanned the commons the way he scanned everything, like an owner taking inventory. Young mothers, fine. The Hendricks woman walking her terrier, fine. Old Whitaker on his bench, a nuisance but a known nuisance. And then the man by the cedar. Stranger, backpack. Cap pulled down over the face, which Dale did not like at all, because in Dale's experience, men pulled their caps down when they had something to hide. Sitting too long. Cedar Hollow had had a string of break-ins over the past 2 months. Garages, mostly, a couple of sheds, and the town council had been on the department about it. And here was a stranger with a hidden face casing the park in broad daylight. That was how Dale told it to himself, anyway. And this is the part worth slowing down for, because Dale Brunner was not a cartoon. He genuinely believed he was protecting his town. He had a reason that sounded like a reason. He would have told you, with total sincerity, that he was simply using his professional experience, his trained eye, his 2 decades of knowing what trouble looked like. That is the most dangerous kind of prejudice there is. Not the kind that shows up in a white hood, but the kind that puts on a uniform and calls itself expertise. It is harder to see and harder to argue with, because the man wearing it is sure he is just doing his job. There was something else underneath it too, though Dale would never have admitted to it, would not even have been able to find it in himself if he went looking. 4 months earlier, the town council had held a public meeting about a proposed building, a residence for homeless veterans, that some foundation wanted to put up on the old mill lot at the edge of town. Dale had gone to that meeting in his off hours, in a polo shirt, as a private citizen, and he had stood up at the microphone and said his piece. He had not used ugly words. He had been careful. He had talked about property values, and traffic, and the schools, and he had said the phrase "that kind of person" more than once. And he had sat down to a small ripple of approval from people who were relieved that someone had said out loud what they had been thinking quietly. The project had stalled in committee a week later. Dale had felt good about that. He had felt like he had protected something. He did not connect any of that to the man on the bench. Why would he? To Dale, the man on the bench was just a stranger with a hidden face. The fact that the stranger and the building were about to turn out to be the same story was not a thing Dale Brunner's mind was built to see coming. The light turned green. Dale did not drive through it. He flipped his signal and pulled the cruiser to the curb in front of the park entrance. Keanu saw the move from under the brim of his cap. He did not stiffen. He did not look up. But something in him shifted, the quiet recalibration of a man who has spent a lot of his life reading the temperature of a room and has just felt it drop. He took another sip of the cold coffee and waited. The cruiser door swung open and Dale Brunner climbed out, hitching his belts, settling his weight. He put on his sunglasses, even though the morning was overcast and the commons was shaded by the great cedar, because the sunglasses made him a face you could not read, and being a face you could not read was half of Dale's job as he understood it. He started across the grass toward the bench with the unhurried walk of a man who wanted to be watched doing it. Keanu let out a slow breath. Here it comes, he thought. Stay easy. Be polite. Let the man have his morning. Dale stopped about 5 feet from the bench, planted his feet wide, and hooked his thumbs in his belt near the holster. It was a posture built to make a seated man feel small. Keanu did not look up right away. He lowered the coffee cup to his knee, slow and deliberate, the way you move when you want a nervous person to know your hands. Then he tipped his head back just enough to bring the officer into view from under the brim, and offered a small, tired nod. Morning, officer. His voice was low, and even with no edge in it at all. Dale did not return the greeting. He chewed a piece of gum with his mouth slightly open and looked down through the aviators at the cap, the stubble, the backpack. You live around here? It was not a question. It was a verdict looking for a confession. Just passing through, Keanu said. Passing through to where? Meeting someone. Later this morning. Dale's jaw worked the gum. Meeting who? A colleague. Keanu kept his answers short and calm, the brim of the cap still throwing its shadow, his eyes steady in that shadow. We're looking at a property in town. Dale almost laughed. A property? This guy. Take the hat off when you're talking to me. Keanu lifted his chin a fraction more, but the brim still cut a line of shadow across his eyes, and he did not take the cap off. "Am I being detained, officer?" The question landed wrong in Dale Brunner's chest, the way it always did. He was not used to questions. He was used to answers and to fear, and to the small flinch people gave when the badge came close. He took a step nearer, into the space where a man can feel another man's breath, a calculated little invasion. "It's relevant," Dale said, though Keanu had not asked what was relevant, "because I know everybody in this town, and I don't know you. We've had a string of break-ins. Strangers sitting around parks with their faces covered, looking at houses. So let's see some ID." "I haven't looked at any houses," Keanu said. "I'm drinking my coffee." "ID." Keanu was quiet for a moment. He knew the law better than Dale expected him to. Better, in fact, than Dale knew it himself. Oregon was not a stop and identify state. A person sitting on a public bench committing no crime was under no obligation to hand a police officer his identification. And an officer had his specific, articulable suspicion of an actual crime before he could lawfully demand it. Keanu also knew that knowing the law and being safe are different things. One in front of you had decided how the morning was going to go before he ever got out of the car. "Officer," Keanu said, his voice still level, the cap still low, "I'm happy to talk to you. But I'd like to understand what crime you think I've committed. If I'm free to go, I'd like to finish my coffee." "You're free to go when I say you're free to go." "That's not actually how it works," Keanu said gently, without any heat in it, which somehow made it worse for Dale than if he had shouted. "Either you're detaining me, which means you have to be able to say what crime you suspect, or if I'm free to go, in which case I'd like to sit here. It can't be both. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm just asking which one it is." It was the calm that undid Dale. He could have handled anger. Anger he understood. Anger he could meet and beat. But this man was not angry. He was patient and precise and a little sad. And he was right about the law. And every word he said in that even voice made Dale Brunner feel, somewhere below the he let himself feel things, that he was the one being watched and found wanting. And Dale could not stand that feeling. He had built 22 years specifically so that he would never have to feel that feeling again. Across the green, Cornelius Whitaker set down his bag of crackers. The pigeons scattered. The old man's hands had stopped shaking, the way they sometimes did when something mattered enough to steady them. And he was watching the bench by the cedar with a still and growing dread, because he had seen this kind of thing before, many times, from the wrong end of it. And he knew how fast it could go bad. Dale Brunner's face had gone a deep, blotchy red. The veins in his neck stood out against his collar. "You want to play lawyer?" he said. "Stand up." Keanu did not move. "I'm comfortable here." "I said stand up." Dale's voice climbed, and his hand drifted back to rest on the grip of his taser, and a young mother near the bandshell gathered her child and walked quickly away. The raised voice carried across the quiet at Commons. Two teenagers who had been doing ollies off the curb at the far end of the park, a lanky kid named Trevor and his shorter friend Jesse, stopped what they were doing. They had grown up on 1,000 videos of exactly this, and some instinct older than thought made both of them reach for their phones at the same time. Dale saw the phones come up. In another officer, that might have been the moment caution arrived. In Dale Brunner, it did the opposite. He wanted the audience now. He wanted these people to see him keep their town clean, wanted them to watch Dale Brunner handle a situation, because in Dale's mind, the worst thing a man could be in front of a crowd was uncertain. And the one thing he was sure he could still do after everything the years had taken was look certain. He leaned down close to the brim of the cap, close enough that Keanu could smell stale coffee and peppermint gum, and dropped his voice to something low and ugly. "Last time. Take the hat off, show me ID, or I put you in cuffs for failure to comply. Your choice." Keanu looked up at him from under the brim, and for a moment the two men simply held each other's eyes in the gray morning light, one face hidden in the shadow of a worn cap, the other hidden behind a pair of unnecessary sunglasses. Two men refusing, for very different reasons, to show their faces. Then, without breaking the officer's gaze, Keanu Reeves reached down, set his cold coffee on the bench beside him, and very slowly placed both of his open hands on his knees where everyone could see them. "On your feet," Dale said. "Now." Keanu rose slowly from the bench, keeping his hands visible the entire time, the way a man does when he understands that every motion he makes is about to be interpreted by someone looking for a reason. He stood to his full height, taller than Dale expected, and for 1 second, Dale felt the small uncertainty that bullies feel when the thing they have decided to push turns out to be more solid than it looked. Then his pride closed back over the uncertainty like water over a stone. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Officer," Keanu said, not in volume but in temperature, gone quiet and very clear. "You are making a mistake. I'm not going to fight you. But I'm telling you, before you do this in front of these cameras, that you have the wrong read on this situation. I would take a breath if I were you." It was the closest Keanu came, in the entire encounter, to a warning. And like most warnings given to men like Dale Brunner, it did the opposite of what it should have. Dale heard it not as information, but as a challenge to his authority in front of an audience. And the audience was the one thing he could not lose face in front of. "Turn around," Dale barked, and he grabbed Keanu's shoulder and spun him toward the bench. Keanu did not resist. He let himself but to return. He put his hands behind his back. The cap stayed on his head, brim still low, and that detail would matter later, because in every frame the teenagers were recording, the man being arrested still had no visible face. He was a stranger in a cap being put in handcuffs by a police officer, and that was all that anyone watching could see, which meant the only story available was the one the Fosser was telling. Dale ratcheted the cuffs on tight, tighter than he needed to, and put a hand on the back of Keen Ank and pressed him down toward the bench, then thought better of the optics of that, and hauled him back upright. Through it all, Keanu said only one thing, loudly and clearly, his face turned so the phones could catch the words even if they could not catch his eyes. "I am not resisting. I am unarmed. I am complying." He said it for the cameras, because he had learned a long time ago that the record is the only thing that survives a moment like this intact. And he intended for the record to be very clear. That was when Cornelius Whitaker got up off his bench. The old man crossed the green faster than a 71-year-old in a pinned-together coat had any business moving. And he came up short a few feet away with his hands open and trembling, and his voice cracking with urgency. "Officer. Officer, son, you need to stop. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know who that is." Dale did not even turn his head. "Sit down, Whitaker, before I run you in, too. You listen to me." Cornelius's voice broke. "I'm telling you, you have got this so wrong. You have no idea. That man is a good man. He is the reason I'm not dead under a bridge. You need to take those cuffs off him right now." "Sit down." Dale finally looked at him, and the look was pure contempt, the look a man gives a thing he considers beneath argument. To Dale, this was simply one vagrant defending another, the natural sympathy of the gutter for the gutter. He filed the old man's panic under noise and turned back to his prisoner. But Cornelius Whitaker had already done the only thing he could do. While Dale's back was turned, with hands that shook so badly, he had to try the screen 3 times. The old man had pulled out a battered prepaid phone, the not kind the foundation gave to the men it housed so they could always reach help, and he had not called the police. He had not called 911. He had scrolled to a number he had kept for 11 years and never once used, a direct line to the Open Door Foundation's office, and he had called Pamela Greer. Pamela Greer had run the Foundation's daily operations for 9 years, and in 9 years the emergency line, the one given only to residents, had rung perhaps a dozen times, and never about this. She was at her desk with a cup of tea going cold when it lit up, and she almost let it go to the service before something made her pick it up. The voice on the other end was old and breaking and hard to follow at first. A man, crying maybe, or close to it. It took her a moment to understand that he was not calling about himself. "They've got him," the old man was saying. "They've got him in cuffs, ma'am, the police. Right here in the park," and he didn't do anything. He was just sitting there. And I tried to tell them. I tried to tell that officer who he was, and he wouldn't listen. He called me. He told me to sit down. Ma'am, they don't know who they've got. Slow down, Pamela said. Already standing. Already reaching for the other phone. Who, sir? Who do they have? And the Olsen said the name. Not the public name, the board name. The one only a handful of people would have known to attach to a tired man in a cap on a park bench in a town nobody had heard of. And Pamela Greer went very still for about 4 seconds, the length of time it takes for the bottom to drop out of an ordinary morning. And then she became extremely efficient. She got the name of the town. She got the old man's name and told him, gently, to stay where he was. That help was already coming, that he had done exactly the right thing. Then she hung up and sat for 1 more second with her hand flat on the desk, and then she made 2 calls. The first was to Vanessa Calloway, a civil rights attorney. The foundation kept on press retainer because incidents like this one, smaller versions of this one, happened to the foundation's residents more often than the comfortable world liked to think. Vanessa picked up on the second ring, listened for 90 seconds, and was reaching for her car keys before Pamela finished. The second call was harder to place, but went through faster than it had any right to, because the Open Door Foundation was a named partner in the state's Veteran Housing Initiative, the kind of public-private arrangement that governors like to stand in front of at ribbon cuttings. When Pamela told the aide who answered the governor's line, whose name was involved, and what had just happened to him in a municipal park, there was a silence on the other end. And then the sound of a person sitting up very straight, and then the aide that said in a different voice entirely, "Give me the name of that police department again. Now let me stop here for a second, because something is about to start moving that Dale Brunner cannot see, and it is worth understanding what it is. When a police officer detains a person without lawful cause, harasses them, and arrests them on invented charges, the law has a name for what he has done. It is called deprivation of rights under color of law. The phrase is old and precise. Color of law means the officer is using the appearance of legal authority, the badge, the uniform, the cuffs, to do something the law does not actually permit. It is one of the few ways an individual police officer can lose the shield of qualified immunity that normally protects officers from personally sued. And it is a federal matter, which means it does not stay inside the cozy walls of a local department where complaints go soft. Dale Brunner had spent 22 years operating as though the only law that mattered was the one he enforced on his own street. He was about to learn that there was a much larger law, and that it had been watching the whole time through the lens of a teenager's phone. Dale walked Keanu toward the cruiser. A small crowd had gathered now along the edge of the commons, drawn by the raised voices, and they watched in the particular silence of people who sense they are seeing something wrong, but are not sure they are allowed to say so. A second cruiser pulled up, and a young officer got out, a woman in her late 20s named Maya Donnelly, who had been on the force 8 months and still believed, mostly, that the job was about helping people. "Dale," Maya said carefully, taking in the scene, the cuffed man, the old man pleading, the phones. "Dale, what do we have?" Stranger casing the park, refused to ID, resisted. Dale opened the back door of his cruiser. Failure to comply, resisting, disorderly. "Help me get him processed." Maya looked at the man in cuffs. He was not struggling. He was standing very straight, his face hidden under the brim of the cap, his whole body radiating a stillness that did not match the word resisting at all. Something about it bothered her. She had filled out enough reports to know the difference between a person who had fought and a person who had simply declined, and every instinct she had told her this man had declined. "Did he actually resist?" she asked quietly. "Just for Dale, because he doesn't look like a guy who—" "You questioning me?" Dale snapped. 8 months on the job and you're questioning a 22-year veteran? Get in your car and follow me to the station." Keanu, being guided into the back seat, turned his head toward the young officer. He did not accuse her. He did not ask her to save him. He simply said, in that low, even voice, a single quiet question that she would think about for a long time afterward. "Have you looked at it for yourself yet?" Then Dale put a hand on his head and pushed him into the cage and shut the door. Maya stood on the grass for a moment with the question sitting in her chest. "Have you looked at it for yourself yet?" She had not. She had taken Dale's word, the way she had taken Dale's word a dozen times before, because that was easier, and because Dale had 22 years and she had 8 months. She looked at the teenagers with their phones. She looked at the old man, Cornelius, who had sunk down onto the curb with his head in his shaking hands. And for the first time in her short career, Maya Donnelly decided she was going to look at something for herself. She walked over to the two teenagers, Trevor and Jesse, who were still standing there with the stunned, electric look of kids who know they have just filmed something that matters. "Can I see it?" she asked. Trevor glanced at his friend, then held up the phone and played it back for her. Maya watched the whole thing. She watched a man on a bench answer politely and keep his hands visible and ask, reasonably, whether he was being detained. She watched Dale escalate, step by step, each step his own choice, until a man who had done nothing was face down on the grass. She watched it the way you watch something you cannot unwatch. When it was done, she did not ask the boys to delete it. She asked them, instead, not to lose it, and she gave Trevor her own cell number and told him she might need a copy. And the asking of that, from a uniformed officer, told both boys more clearly than any speech that the uniform on the grass and the uniform in front of them were not going to tell the same story. Inside the cruiser, Dale glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see fear or anger or the sullen slump of a man who knew he was beaten. Instead, he saw the man in the cap leaning his head back against the cage with his eyes closed, looking, if anything, tired. Patient, like a man waiting out a delay he had seen coming. "Not so mouthy now," Dale said, pulling away from the curb. "You can lawyer up all you want at the station. Out here, this is my town." "You should turn your camera back on," Keanu said, eyes still closed. Dale's stomach gave a small lurch because he had in fact reached down a moment earlier and pressed the power button on his body spanker for a 3 count, the little trick he had used before, and he had not realized the man had noticed. "Camera's working fine," he said. "It isn't," Keanu said, "and turning it off the way you just did is its own kind of problem. But that's not my problem to solve. You think you're real smart." Dale's voice had an edge of unease in it now that had not been there before. Keanu opened his eyes and looked at the back of Dale Brunner's red neck in the gray morning light, and what was in his face was not triumph and not even anger. It was something closer to sadness, the particular sadness of a man watching another man dig a hole and being unable to take the shovel away. "I think," Keanu said, "that you decided who I was before you got out of the car, and everything since then has just been you, trying to make the world match the decision. I've seen it before. It never ends where the person thinks it's going to end." Dale did not answer that. He drove the 8 block to Sublastus Slocks to the station with his lights on and his siren whooping, though there was no emergency and no traffic, because he wanted the town to see him bringing in the stranger, wanted them to know that Dale Brunner kept Cedar Hollow safe. He had no idea that the spectacle he was making would become, within a day, the single worst decision of his life, replayed and frozen, and studied by more people than lived in every town in the valley combined. He had no idea, either, that while he drove, Pamela Greer had already hung up with a shaking, weeping Cornelius Whitaker, sat very still for about 4 seconds, and then set the machine in motion. Vanessa Calloway was already in her car. The governor's office was already calling a sheriff named Earl Sutton, who was, at that exact moment, 8 blocks away, setting down his own coffee with a hand that had begun, inexplicably, to feel cold. The Cedar Hollow police station was a low building of cinder block and fluorescent light, and Dale marched his prisoner in through the back, past the booking desk, where a younger officer named Pruitt looked up from his paperwork. "What have you got, Dale?" "Big one." Dale dropped the worn backpack on the counter with a thud. "Stranger in the Commons. Casing the park, wouldn't ID, resisted. Book him. Prints, photo, the works. Let's get him in the system." He still had not taken the cap off the man, and Pruitt, glancing at the prisoner, standing quiet and straight by the counter with his face in shadow, felt the same small wrongness, that Maya had felt and could not have said why. They sat Keanu down on a metal bench against the wall, still cuffed, while Dale filled out the booking sheet, and Keanu endured it the way you endure weather. They had taken his shoelaces and his belt, the small ritual humiliations, and he had let them. Because there was no version of fighting this in a cinderblock room that ended well for anyone. And because he had learned long ago that dignity is not something another person can take from you by taking your shoelaces. It is only something you can give away. And Keanu had no intention of giving it away to Dale Brunner. He sat on the bench and he thought about Cornelius. He had recognized the old man on the far bench. He had walked into the Commons that morning, the way you recognize someone you have shared a particular kind of evening with. And he had felt the small, private gladness of seeing that a man he has once met under hard circumstances was still here, still going. He had not approached him. That had been deliberate, the same discipline as the cap. If Keanu had walked over and sat down with Cornelius, he would have changed the morning for both of them, made it about him, turned a quiet reunion into a scene. So he had let Cornelius be, and Cornelius had let him be, two men keeping each other's anonymity in a public park. And there had been a kind of grace in it. And now the old man had spent that grace, all of it in one go, to defend Keanu out loud in front of a crowd. Keanu understood exactly what that had cost. Cornelius had spent 11 years rebuilding the thing the streets take from a person. The sense of being someone, and he had been spleefeet his invisibility, and he had thrown the invisibility away, the instant Keanu needed it thrown away. People talk about courage like it is a thing you do with your body. Most of the real kind is done with your reputation, your safety, the small piece you have managed to scrape together. And Cornelius Whitaker had laid all of his on the grass next to a man in handcuffs without a second of hesitation. Keanu sat in the cinderblock room and thought, I will not forget that. Whatever happens with this officer, whatever happens with any of it, I will not forget who stood up. Dale sat across from him, filling out the report, narrating under his breath as he wrote, building the version of events he needed. Subject refused lawful order. Subject assumed aggressive posture. He glanced up once, at the silent man in the cap, and felt a flicker of the unease that had started in the cruiser and pushed it down and kept writing. Then he set down his pen, reached for the worn backpack on the counter, and unzipped it to find the evidence that would make all of this make sense. He was looking, he told himself, for the stolen tools or the pried-open lockboxes that would justify everything he had done. He did not find them. He found a folder. Inside the folder were documents on heavy letterhead that read the open door-indation. This was a set of architectural drawings, blueprints for a low, handsome building with a gym and a library and rows of small private rooms. Labeled across the top, Cedar Hollow Veterans Residence, Propose D. There was a laminated card identifying the bearer as a member of the Foundation's Board of Directors. A letter on the same letterhead, confirming a 10 o'clock meeting office with the Cedar Hollow Town Planning Office regarding the proposed site. Dale stared at the blueprints. Something cold began to move in his gut because he recognized the project. The proposed veterans' residence had been assumed for 4 months ago, and Dale Brunner had stood up at the public comment microphone and argued against it. He had said, in those words, that he did not want that kind of person in his town. He had helped lead the small, polite, vicious campaign that had stalled the project. And now he was standing at the booking desk holding the blueprints for the very building he had fought, pulled out of the backpack of the man he'd had just arrested for the crime of sitting still in a park. He did not understand yet how completely the pieces fit, but he understood enough to feel the floor tilt. Officer Pruitt had come around the counter and was looking at the board member card. Dale, he said slowly. Dale, this guy's on the board of, this is the foundation that does the veteran housing, the state one, the one the governor talks about. He looked up. Why is he in cuffs? He resisted, Dale said, but the word had lost its shape in his mouth. You should look in the other pocket, the prisoner said quietly. Dale did not want to. But the room had gone still around him, and Pruitt was watching. and so he reached into the side pocket of the backpack and drew out a sectioned, smaller item. It was a photograph, worn soft at the edges from being carried. It showed the man from the bench, cap off, face clear, standing in a half-built doorway in a hard hat, with his arm around the shoulders of an old man both officers half recognized, an old man in a coat pinned at the elbow. It was Cornelius Whitaker. On the back, in pen, someone had written, "Cornelius's place. First resident. The day we topped out the roof." The front door of the station banged open. It was not a riot, and it was not a drunk. It was the Cedar Hollow sheriff, Earl Sutton, a broad, calm man who almost never hurried, and he was hurrying now, his face the color of old ash. Behind him came a woman in a sharp coat carrying a leather bag, and behind her, moving more slowly, leaning on the arm of a young officer who had clearly driven him, was Cornelius Whitaker himself. And behind all of them stood Maya Donnelly, holding up her own phone with the teenager's video already cued. "Earl," Dale started. "Earl, I can explain this guy. Don't." Sheriff Sutton's voice was low and terrible. "Don't say one more word, Dale. I just got off the phone with the governor's office. Do you understand me? The governor's office called my station about an arrest you made 40 minutes ago. Do you have any idea what you have done?" The woman in the sharp coat set her bag on the counter. "Vanessa Calloway," she said, to the room, in the even tone of a person who has done this many times. "I'm an attorney. I represent the gentleman your officer has in handcuffs, and I represent the Open Door Foundation." She looked at the cuffs, at the cap, at the tight set of Keanu's shoulders, and something in her went very cold and very quiet. "Take those off him now." Sheriff Sutton did not order anyone else to do it. He did it himself. His big hands were not quite steady as he found the key and unlocked the cuffs. And when they came free, Keanu brought his hands round, slowly, and rubbed each wrist where the metal had bitten in, and he did not say a word. Then, in the silence of that fluorescent room, with every person in it watching, Keanu Reeves reached up with both hands and took off the cap. He lifted it slowly, the way you set down something you have carried a long way, and he ran one hand back through the hair the cap had flattened, and he raised his face fully into the hard light for the first time since the morning began. And the room changed. You could feel it change. Pruitt made a small sound. Maya Donnelly's hand, still holding up her phone, went still. The face that had been hidden in shadow on a park bench, the face no camera had caught in all the long minutes of the arrest, was a face that everyone in that station had seen 100 times, on screens, in theaters, looking back at them from the world they thought they understood. For Dale Brunner, the recognition arrived in stages, and each stage was worse than the last. First, just the simple jolt of a known face in an unknown place, the brain stuttering the way it does when you see your dentist at the grocery store. Then the name surfacing. Then, riding in right behind the name, the full and total understanding of what he had done, who he had thrown on the grass, who he had cuffed and paraded and shoved into a cage with the siren going. And finally, last and heaviest, the blueprints under his hand. The building he had stood up at a microphone to kill, catching at last to the man in front of him, the circuit closing. The whole shape of it landing on him at once. Keanu did not say, "Do you know who I am?" He never would. He simply held the cap in his hands and let his uncovered face say the thing he would not. And the saying of it landed harder than any words could have, because it arrived all at once, in the gap between the man they had decided he was and the man he turned out to be. The teenagers had caught it. That was the clip that would go everywhere. Not the arrest, but this, the cap coming off, the recognition moving across the room like a change in the weather. The internet would do what the internet does with it, but that came later. In the room in that moment, there was only the long-held breath of a dozen people realizing at the same time exactly how wrong one had been. Dale Brunner stood at the booking desk, holding a backpack full of blueprints for a building he had tried to kill, and he felt the whole architecture of his certainty come down around him. And here is where this story refuses to give you the clean and easy ending, because Dale Brunner did not crumble and confess. Men like Dale almost never do. What Dale did was reach for the rail. "Okay," he said, and his voice was already rebuilding itself, already finding the shape of the version he could live inside. Okay, look, anybody would have made the same call. Stranger, face covered, backpack, sitting in the park after the break-ins we've had. I followed procedure. I didn't know who he was. That's not on me, that's... How was I supposed to know? He looked around the room for someone to agree with him, and found no one, and kept going anyway. I was protecting this town. That's my job. You can't fault a man for doing his job. You demanded ID with no lawful basis, Vanessa Calloway said, not raising her voice. You escalated a non-detention into an arrest because a man asked you a question you didn't like. You used force on a compliant person, and then... She paused. You turned off your body camera. Camera malfunctioned, Dale said quickly. The Cedar Hollow body cameras, Vanessa said, are the same model used by half the departments in this state. They have a pre-event buffer that retains 30 seconds of video before activation, and a fail-safe that keeps the micro recording for 2 minutes after an improper shutdown. Specifically, so that officers cannot do what you just told this room you did not do. She let that sit. We'll be requesting the full file. Dale's mouth opened and closed. He had not known that. He had genuinely not known that, and the not knowing was written all over his face, and that, more than anything else, was the moment the room stopped believing him. It doesn't matter what's on the camera, Dale tried grabbing for the next handhold. I had reasonable suspicion. We've had break-ins. He matched a profile, a stranger, hanging around, face covered. What profile? Vanessa said. Describe the suspect from the break-ins. Height, weight, vehicle. You put out a description, surely, over 22 years and a string of burglaries, serious enough to justify throwing a man on the ground. What did it say? Dale said nothing. Because there had been no description. Because there had been no profile. Because the only thing the man on the bench had matched was the picture Dale carried in his own head of what trouble looked like. There's no profile, Vanessa said quietly, to the room as much as to Dale. There's a man who decided a stranger looked wrong and built a crime around the feeling. That's not police work. That has a name, and the name is the thing the federal government is going to be very interested in. I was protecting this town, Dale said, and now there was something almost pleading underneath the defiance, because the story he told himself was the only floor he had left to stand on, and he could feel it going. 22 years. 22 years I kept this place safe, and one bad morning, one judgment call, and you people are going to. He was drinking coffee, Sheriff Sutton said. The big man's voice was tired and final. Dale. He was sitting on a bench, drinking coffee, waiting for a meeting at the planning office, and you put him face down on the grass in front of the whole town. There's no judgment call in that sentence. There's just the bench and the coffee and what you did. And here is the thing the story will not pretend otherwise about. Dale Brunner never said he was sorry. Not in that room, not later. He went on insisting, in some chamber of himself where the lights never came on, that anyone would have done the same, that he had been protecting people, that the world had overreacted to one understandable mistake. He built a version of that morning he could live inside, and he moved into it, and as far as anyone knows, he is living there still. That is what men like Dale do. They do not get the redemption scene. They get the version of the past that lets them sleep, and they pay for it in a currency they never quite let themselves count. Sheriff Sutton held out his hand. Dale, gun. You're on administrative leave pending the investigation. There's going to be a federal one too, you understand that? Civil Rights Division. This isn't mine to make go away. This was never going to be mine to make go away. Earl, 22 years. Come on. 22 years, the sheriff said heavily, and you spent the last 40 minutes of them on a video that the governor has already seen. Badge. Now. Dale Brunner unclipped his holster and set his weapon on the counter. Then, with hands that had begun to shake the way Cornelius's hands shook, he unpinned the badge from his chest and set it down beside the gun. He looked around the room one more time for an ally, and the other officers, men and women he had worked beside for years, looked at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at him, the way people step back from something they do not want to be standing near. In the middle of all of it, Keanu had crossed the room to where Cornelius Whitaker stood leaning on the young officer's arm. The two men looked at each other. For a moment, the housed and the man who had housed him, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the badge on the counter, or the lawyer, or the governor. "You didn't have to do that," Keanu said quietly. "You gave yourself away. After 11 years of nobody bothering you, you stood up in the middle of all this and made yourself seen. They'll know your face now, too." Cornelius's eyes were wet, but he was smiling a little. "Shep," he said. Keanu blinked. "You remembered my dog's name 11 years ago," the old man said. "At that dinner. You leaned over and you said, 'Shep, that's a good name for a dog.' And then you listened to the rest of my fool story like it was the only thing happening in the world." His voice cracked. Nobody had done that in years. "You think I was going to sit on that bench and watch them put you face down on the grass and not say a word? No, sir. Not me. Not for you." Keanu put his hand on the old man's shoulder and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have been the thing itself, or just in the thing itself. And the people in that fluorescent room, the officers and the lawyer and the sheriff, watched two men who the morning had decided were nobody stand together in the middle of everything, and at least one of them understood, finally, what kind of fault mistake had almost been made. What happened next happened fast, the way it does now. The clip the teenagers had filmed, the cap coming off, the recognition rippling across the booking room, was online before Keanu had even left the station, and it did not behave like a normal video. It behaved like a brush fire. By that evening, it had been watched more times than there were people in the con. By the next morning, the story was on the national news. Not as a celebrity item, but as something larger. A story that people seemed to need, about a man the world adored being treated, for the length of one gray morning, exactly the way the world treated thousands of people it had decided not to look at. The framing wrote itself. If this could happen to him, with his face under that cap, what happens every single day to the people who have no face the world will recognize when the cap comes off? That was the part that gave the story its teeth, and Keanu knew it, and it was the only part of the whole affair that he ever spoke about publicly. He gave exactly one statement, through Vanessa, and it did not mention his own name or his own ordeal at all. It said, "The reason this became news is that it happened to someone you recognized. Remember that it happens constantly to people you don't." He would not add a word to it. When reporters pushed, he pointed them, every time, back to those two sentences. Dale Brunner's name went around too, of course, the way these names do. And for a few weeks he was the most hated man in the state. And then the internet moved on the way it always moves on, leaving him standing in the wreckage of a life that did not get to move on with it. Let me tell you where everyone landed, because real endings are never symmetric, and this one is not. Dale Brunner was placed on leave, and then, after the investigation, let go. The Federal Review took the better part of a year. And in the end, he was not sent to prison, though he was charged, and the case cost him everything he had left to fight it. He was not a monster who got a monster's ending. He was a man who had been wrong in a way that finally caught up with him, and the catching up was slow and grinding and undramatic, the way it usually is in life, and almost never is in the stories we tell about it. His wife, Sharon, took their kids and went to stay with her sister, and whether she came back the story does not say, because Sharon's life was her own, and not a lesson for anyone. Some of the people in Cedar Hollow, who had nodded along with Dale at that council meeting, who had agreed quietly that they did not want that kind of person in their town, never said a word of apology to anyone. They simply grew quiet on the subject and crossed the street when they saw Cornelius coming, the same as before. Prejudice that polite does not announce its own defeat. It just goes back underground and waits. Maya Donnelly was the one who testified. She was the only officer who did, the one who had looked at it for herself, and it cost her something on the force, a coldness from certain colleagues that never entirely thawed. Keanu never forgot it. When the Cedar Hollow Veterans Residence finally opened, there was a quiet scholarship attached to it. for the children of local first responders, and the first recipient was chosen by a small committee on which Maya Donnelly was asked, by name, to serve. She never knew for certain it was him. She suspected. And Cornelius Whitaker. Cornelius, who had crossed a green faster than his old legs should have allowed, who had made the phone call that started everything, who had kept a man's secret out of kindness and then broken it out of a deeper kindness, did not live to see the building open. He died that winter. In his small, warm room, in the building open door had put up for him 11 years before. In his sleep, the safety-pinned coat hanging on the back of the door. He died housed and known and remembered, which is more than the country he had served had once seemed willing to grant him. But he died before the Cedar Hollow residence topped out its roof, before the doors opened, before the building that would bear his name welcomed its first resident. That is the part the story cannot fix. The man who saved Keanu Reeves on a gray morning in a park did not get to stand in the doorway of what his phone call helped build. Some debts the world simply never gets around to paying, and the kindest people are often the ones it stiffs. The closing scene is a small one, months on. The Cedar Hollow Veterans Residence opened on a clear spring morning, the rain holding off for once, the new paint bright against the cedars. Over the front entrance was a modest sign that did not bear Keanu's name, because he had asked that it not, and did bear another. It read the Whitaker House. Keanu came to the opening, but he did not speak, and afterward, while the small crowds moved inside to see the gym and the library and the rooms, he slipped away across the street to the commons and sat down on the wrought iron bench nearest the great cedar, the same bench with a paper cup of black coffee and his worn backpack at his feet. He did not have the cap on. He had stopped wearing it, mostly. There did not seem to be much point anymore in Cedar Hollow. A police cruiser came slowly down the street. The officer driving it was new, a young man Keanu did not recognize. And as he passed the commons, he slowed and looked over at the man on the bench, and then looked across at the children playing on the new lawn in front of the Whitaker house. And he lifted one hand off the wheel in an easy, unremarkable wave. Keanu raised a hand back. Then he sat a while longer in the soft gray light, finished his coffee, picked up his backpack, and walked on toward the next town, where nobody knew his face yet, and where some park bench was waiting to find out what kind of place it was. I keep coming back to the phone call. Not the cap coming off, not the governor, not the badge sliding across the counter. The phone call. An old man in a coat pinned at the elbow, with hands that shook so badly he had to try the screen 3 times, calling a number he had kept for 11 years and never once used. We tell these stories as though rescue comes from above, from the admiral, the lawyer, the powerful friend who arrives in time. But the person who actually saved Keanu Reeves that morning was the one man in that park whom everybody else had already decided not to see. Cornelius Whitaker, who knew exactly what it felt like to be looked through, was the only one who looked. And here is the part I cannot put down. Keanu had a face under that cap, a face that could turn a whole room around the second he uncovered it. A key that unlocked the door of everyone's assumptions in slow motion. Cornelius never had a key like that. He spent his whole life being judged in 10 seconds by people who never bothered to look again, and he had no cap to take off that would make them stop. The difference between the two men was not worth, and it was not goodness. It was only that one of them, in the end, had a way to prove the world wrong, and the other one just had to live in it. That is the part that stays with me. While this story is fictional, the lessons about who we decide is worth looking at twice, and who we look through are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue making and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.